My name is Eric Shabazz, and you're listening to the Invisible Hand Podcast. The world's ran by human nature, self-interest, and power. Let's get into it. This episode of the Invisible Hand Podcast, we're going to be actually referencing a book called Me and White Supremacy, written by Layla F. Saad. And we're going to be referencing a lot of the contents and points that she made in this book today. So what I'm going to break down to you is white supremacy. Does it exist? How does it manifest itself in our society? And should white people actually change their behavior to compensate for the advantage that they have, supposedly because of white privilege? I'm also going to break down toward the end of the episode why I personally believe that it's not realistic to expect white people to kind of change their behavior toward you in a competitive society like the United States. I don't also think that it's realistic to have an ideology where we run around as a social group telling other white people, hey, you need to recognize your white privilege. But before we get into all that, we're going to lay out all of the claims and all of the challenges to this issue. So in the book, Me and White Supremacy, one of the key things we're going to start off with is in her chapter, she talks about white and white passing people enjoy huge privileges even if they don't realize it. So this is one of the central themes of her book. And let's go ahead and just take a little excerpt real quick so you can get the idea of what she's claiming. She talks about white privilege from this perspective. You're experiencing white privilege if, when you learn about history, it tends to be the history of your own race, or when you go shopping and you find products that fit your own cultural identity. You're experiencing white privilege if you don't have to worry that your race will damage your chances of getting legal or medical assistance, or if you can bring up your kids without having to warn them about racism ahead of time. So in her eyes, she's basically saying these are free ideals of the everyday privileges that white Americans have in America just by virtue of them being white and being the majority. Now, first of all, are these legitimate claims? 100%. So I would say it is very true that because they're the majority population in the United States, there are some advantages. Because I remember personally, actually, when I was in history class, when I was a younger kid, that when we got to American history, I remember there was a very short section toward the end of history class about American history and slavery. And really, it didn't feel very good because I realized after going through an entire year of American history class, telling the story of America, the only time they really mentioned black people in the story of American history was during struggle where we're being oppressed. So it made me feel bad, like this is our history here. It showed civil rights, it showed them owning slaves. And that was pretty much the history that was put in my head and simultaneously put in all the other white kids' head in the class. So that's a form of the natural supremacy of being the majority. So she actually says that it's white supremacy. So it depends on what word you want to use, but ultimately there is some type of advantage growing up being part of the dominant class, and it does affect both whites and blacks psychologically, especially when they're young. I'll give you an example of why I think this stuff does exist from a more practical sense. I'll give you an example. I'm into entrepreneurship and business. And I remember when I was growing up, I was looking for business people to look up to emulate. And I remember looking up to Elon, looking up to Bill Gates, looking up to Steve Jobs, right? And so the reason white supremacy or this idea of white privilege does exist is because sometimes it can affect you in real worlds. So I'll give you an example. When I'm looking up to Steve Jobs and all these people, I'm reading their biography. I'm looking at how they started their companies. I'm looking at people who gave them opportunity. And I'm thinking, well, if I work as hard, if I'm as smart, and I come up with great products, that I too can do what Steve Jobs can do. And that's true to a certain extent, but it's not as true as it is for another white kid who's similar to me that have the same skills and talent because of this. Because a lot of the things that happened for Steve Jobs or Mark Zuckerberg or Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk may not play out that way for me, given the reality of the country. The majority of venture capitalists invest invest in startups that are using something called pattern matching, for instance. And what that is they are looking for certain traits, and they're looking at previous startups and saying, who's most likely going to be successful as a startup founder? Well, if you're a black technical founder and they're not used to seeing you, in their head, it's an immediate risk. Also, a lot of these kids who started these companies come from upper middle class families. A lot of poor people, a lot of black people don't grow up with a lot of money. So when I'm using these role models, I'm projecting if I do what they do, I can get the same result. But the world that they live in is not completely the same world that I live in. So there's a level of cognitive dissonance that affects me just by virtue of not being part of the dominant class and even having these role models. So that's just an example of why it exists and how it can affect you even when you're coming up and aspiring to work hard and do all the things that you should do in America to get ahead. Now, the next question becomes, why does this happen, right? Why is this white supremacy even here? And the big question becomes, is it some evil plan where white people are trying to subjugate blacks and they just dislike them and despise them, and in every corner they're trying to do them wrong? That happened during slavery. There are small elements of that in society, but it's mostly hidden. But overall, the general white population is not necessarily doing that. What they're doing at this point is just simply acting in their best interest. And the momentum of all of their advantage from the past is chugging forward while they act in their best interest. And it is some level of privilege. I'll give you an example. Why does this white privilege or white supremacy exist? It's the result of being a minority in a multiracial society. So white people are the dominant group in the society. They have the dominant amount of wealth, and they have the dominant amount of power positions. That alone, and them acting individually as in their best interest alone, can create a level of privilege and disadvantage for me. Because they're already ahead of you, they already have access to the capital, and now they're acting like any normal human in their best interest. And normally their best interest is working with other people like them, giving other people like them their jobs, opportunities, etc. That's what a normal economy and normal people do. But by virtue of us being a minority in that society, there's a level of privilege, meaning that as an individual, when I act, I have a large group of people who identify with me, and I have a higher probability of when I act, I can be successful. So that's just the reality of it. And so what should you do about it? I'm going to talk about that toward the end of the video. I would say you ultimately, as a black person, you need to be aware of your own internalized inferiority possibility, because it's a possibility when you grow up your entire life, especially like when you're in American history class, and the only time you see yourself as a black kid, you know, is in slavery or civil rights. That can get in your mind. Or anytime you go to a black city or a hood, the only thing you see in that hood is beat down cities, drug dealing, and other stuff, right? You can go to any city in the United States and find a MLK Street, right? And normally if you go to most hoods in the United States or most black areas in the United States, it's beat down. That can start getting internalized into your head. So what should you do about the fact that this privilege, this advantage that white people have exists? Well, first of all, you have to work harder if you're black. You have to recognize that every day when you wake up and do stuff on a daily basis, that there's a lot of discouraging sights that you see. You don't see anybody owning companies that are black. You don't see them controlling industry. You don't see your neighborhoods built up and looking nice. And that stuff can get to you and start to create a level of insecurity in you. And so just recognize that there's a system and a history that made it like this, and realize that now you must try to be a success. And in my personal opinion, the best way to be a success in America is get your morality in line. The drinking, the drugging, taking care of your family, building stable relationships. That is the foundation for a human being, less alone if you're black or white, to be successful. So given that you're already at a disadvantage, you cannot afford to have all these weaknesses and vices that we have. So that's the implication of white supremacy existing. However, in this book that she wrote was really targeted toward white people. She wanted to get the empathy of white people. She wanted to talk to white people who want to do something, who wants to change their behavior, who want to be a part of the solution. And most of this book is about some of the things that they can do. But she spent majority of the book breaking down what are these white supremacist ideals and structures that are already built into our society. Another concept that she discussed in the book that I thought was interesting, and we're going to get more into this on the Invisible Hand podcast, is if you think that you personally don't need to work to combat racism, you're wrong. And here's a quick excerpt from the book. In the book, Me and White Supremacy, the author claims that some rather defensive things white people often say when challenged about white supremacy are the following. I have black friends. Actually, I've dated people of color. Not all white people are racist. Most of these responses circles back to the ideal that you don't need to put in the work to combat racism because you're one of the good ones. So in the book, she wanted to break down some of the common things that you might hear from certain white people when they're confronted with these realities. That, hey, look, we live in a society that's basically leaned toward the white person. It's structured for the white person to have a significant advantage. And whenever black people bring up discrimination or a disadvantage that they have, you'll find some white people react in a defensive manner. And she breaks down how white people who want to be a part of the solution can recognize these things in themselves. And so one of the things that she talks about is the concept of white exceptionalism. It doesn't mean that you think that all white people are exceptional. It just means that you think you're particularly exceptional. Meaning that when I bring up these challenges about the society we live in and how you have an advantage, you tend to say, well, that's not all white people. I'm not like that. It is, in many ways, you're kind of dismissing the responsibility to acknowledge that, hey, you do have an advantage and this is unfair for black people, right? So even though I think it is true that a lot of white people do have these responses, I think that foregoing benefits for others is counter to human nature. And so even though she's claiming that, hey, this is a good tactic to let people know about, I don't think it's human nature to forego benefits that people already have in order to accommodate other people. So I give you an example. A lot of people, by virtue of being white, might just, do the right thing and then go for a house loan and get it, right, very easily. So whatever advantages that people have, they're not necessarily living their life thinking, I have an advantage over a black person. They're just simply thinking, this is my reality. I'm thinking about myself 24/7, and I'm just a white working class person like everybody else. So most white people do not see their privilege. It's not in their conscious mind. So typically when you bring it up to them, they typically say, I'm the exception. And it's not human nature for us. And this is where I kind of disagree with her approach, because she expects in this book that we should be able to tell white people that, hey, you have privilege. You need to change your behavior or be aware that you have advantage. That's great that you tell them, but ultimately I don't think it's realistic that they're going to change their behavior. It's not human nature to give up natural benefits they have in a society by being the majority to you in order for you to catch up. It's unrealistic and it's not natural for human beings to do that. And I just really think that expecting white people to do that is extremely unrealistic. Acting in one's self-interest come natural. And essentially that's what white people are doing. The majority of society is set up for them to win, and they're going to just act in their self-interest. If there's an advantage for them, they're going to take advantage of it. So I don't understand the point in this book, or even in society right now, you're seeing a lot of people running around telling, hey, you have your white privilege, recognize your white privilege. Is it really realistic for you to be telling another white person, hey, you have a privilege, recognize it? I mean, what good is it going to do? Make him feel bad for a little bit, humble him for a little bit. Tomorrow he's going to wake up and try to do what's best for him. He's going to act in his self-interest. So if he wants a job and he has a high probability of getting that job, he's not going to turn that job down for a black kid to get it. And it's unrealistic and short-sighted and really kind of childish for any person, to any black person, to actually expect some person to do that, especially a white person or any other group of person. It's just unrealistic. And like I said, advantage is invisible for most of us. And this doesn't just go for white people. We're all kind of deluded by the advantages that we have. Like I might go through my life and realize, hey, I'm in shape. but I might have actually been born with high metabolism, right? But if somebody that can't keep in shape came up to me and said, hey man, you're privileged because you're born with good genes and you never barely have to work out to stay in shape, I'm going to say, man, what are you talking about, man? I work out all the time. That's an excuse. You need to get your shit together, right? I'm kind of blinded by my own life and my own actions. In some way, I probably am privileged compared to somebody else with bad genetics who's really fat. Right? I do work out, but the fact that I'm already in shape incentivizes me to work out anymore. So I don't really see myself as privileged. I honestly believe that I'm in good shape because of the actions that I do. This is the same thing with white privilege when a black person is approaching a white person and saying, hey, the reason you got that job or the reason you're doing so well is because you're privileged. He's only going to see his life. He hasn't been living his life from your perspective. So he's saying, hey, I went to school, I did the things I was supposed to do, I worked hard, and that's why I got what I got. And a lot of times when you're telling them that they're privileged, you're literally, in their eyes, some of them who are not fully self-aware are thinking you're insulting them. They think that you're making excuses, and they're kind of annoyed by the fact that you're able to claim that they're winning because of some inherent privilege that's structured in society. So is it true that they have advantages, particularly the ones who are doing very well in society or grew up with money or grew up with an elite family? Absolutely. Is it realistic to think, just based on human nature, that you can basically make this argument to white people and they're going to be able to change their behavior, they're going to slow down and let you pass them? It is not realistic. So in this book, even though she's bringing these things to light, I think it's extremely short-sighted to think that people are going to actually do these things. Another thing she talks about as a concept in the book when it comes to denial of basically white privilege or white supremacy in America is white fragility, a defensive overreaction of white people when asked to engage with questions about race. And I believe that this happens because of cognitive dissonance or fight or flight. Basically what you're doing is conflicting with their worldview. Their entire life, they think that they got where they wanted to get in the world because of their own effort. And for the most part, they did. And you're coming to them and say, yeah, you got where you wanted. You got to where you wanted to go with your own effort, but it also was easier because you're white. That conflicts with their worldview. That conflicts with the American ethos that was sold to all of us, that their actions, their perseverance, and the things that they did is the reason they're where they wanted to be. Elon is a billionaire because of how innovative and great he is. That's in his head. So if I were to come to Elon and say, yeah, you are great, but let's be honest, you being white is a large reason why you were able to do it, Elon's not gonna want to hear any of it. Even if deep down on a macro scale, it's true. Elon versus if there were two Elons and one was black and one was white, Elon white would have the advantage, right? But he can't see that, and none of us going to see that because it's human nature. We don't live our lives from the perspective of other people. And that's why it causes cognitive dissonance when you confront white people with this stuff. So with that said, she's basically explaining why people react this way when you bring up your disparities. And so I think admitting advantage is not empowering. So one of the reasons why when you bring these things up to white people, hey, Elon, I know that you're a great inventor and a great entrepreneur, but if you wasn't white, it's a high probability that you wouldn't have been able to do this. You had a lot of advantage, right? Admitting that you had advantage is not empowering. So human beings don't want to do it. It requires extreme humbleness to say, you know what, compared to you, I did have an advantage. You're right about that, right? It doesn't benefit his ego to think that, hey, you know what, part of the reason why I'm winning is because I'm in a good situation. My parents are rich. I got the hookup, right? Nobody wants to believe that because that's not the story they tell themselves their entire lives. And so once you understand that, you'll understand that most of the time when you're bringing these grievances to white people about their advantage, that it is not in their nature to want to admit these things. They're almost blind to it themselves. Another concept that she talks about here is how people need to be aware that they have to actively work to reduce white supremacy. I think it is very, very childish for her to believe that that would work in a society without force. And the reason I say that is because we are living in a society where there's different groups, different races, and different interests. And expecting empathy from your competition is unrealistic. So yes, other groups are competing, blacks and whites and Asians, we're all competing for our own interests on an individual level, on a group level, and several other categoric levels. So in that competition, certain groups have advantages, and those advantages they use to compete in the intergroup competition. Now, from the perspective of the writer of this book, we're asking them to give up their advantages and compete more fairly with us. Is it human nature to give up advantages that are already sold in and baked into the pie willingly? No. You have to negotiate, force, and strategically plan to get those advantages taken out the system. And so in this book, the entire book is written from the perspective of convincing, through bleeding heart effort, white people to change because it's the right thing to do. And from an individual level, it's okay to ask somebody to recognize their white privilege. But from a societal level where we're competing for politics, money, and resources, that's not a realistic strategy. You have to come to the table with a negotiation where they're forced to make changes in order to keep you a part of the game. So what is her solution when it comes to white supremacy in America? She's recommending what can white people do who want to do the right thing to help alleviate this advantage, this white privilege, this white supremacy that's built into the structure of the system. And her recommendation is as follows. True allyship requires in-depth engagement and a willingness to acknowledge mistakes. In the book, Me and White Supremacy, the author believes the real allyship involves acknowledging that this is a conversation that isn't about you, meaning white people, whether you feel hurt, embarrassed, or whatever else. It's actually about black people. Real allyship involves making the struggle of black people your own and acting in support of them no matter what. Now, I think that this is extremely short-sighted to expect white Americans who are living their lives, working hard at their jobs, to make your fight their central theme. Now, I understand that it's the right thing to do for somebody who's morally aligned and humble, but to expect the average American who's busy in their head trying to make money and get ahead to stop and do this in order to fix this problem is, in my personal opinion, silly. So let's just see what her specific solution is that she claims in this book about white people and their white privilege. Allyship is working in solidarity with black people, not in one-off stances, but steadily and consistently. It involves understanding your own privilege and constantly reevaluating your own relationship with those who have less privilege. So she's just basically saying, be more self-aware. Now, in my personal opinion, I think asking white people to pick up the black struggle is unrealistic. Human beings tend to focus on their own struggles and not others, especially in a competitive society like America. So I think that if she thinks you can change this structure of white supremacy and inequality solely by appealing to white people's heart, she's greatly mistaken. So basically, if you really think about what she's really asking, she's basically asking white people to willingly give up power by being more moral and self-aware and empathetic human beings. Now, that sounds great if you can make people be more self-aware and empathetic human beings, but is that a legitimate strategy to combat the disproportionate nature of the structure of white supremacy that's built into the fabric of America because white people are the dominant group? No. And it's not a strategy that would be effective to making sure that some of these gains that blacks need to happen. And so what is a better solution? In my personal opinion, human beings do not give up power willingly. Being the majority in this country is a privilege for Pacific white people. Is it a privilege for every single white person? No. The majority of people benefiting from white privilege are the elite, or people who are well off, who are smart, who have talent, who have access to capital. They're benefiting most. The average white American is not benefiting much, as this book claims. But there are enough groups of white people who are benefiting, and then the trickle-down effect comes in effect where some other smaller level, lower class white people do eventually benefit in very, very small ways. So we know that they have an advantage. We know they're the dominant group in the country, and we know that there's some inherent biases because they're controlling most of the centers of power, right? It's built into the system. It's human nature. How can we get them to alleviate some of these unfair advantages while we continue to be a part of this country? Well, it won't be by pleading to their heart and their better nature. It's unrealistic as a political strategy for black people. So white privilege should be combated via public policy and negotiation. What does that mean? That means that for every biased, natural human nature thing that groups do, we have to go find where that privilege exists and then institute regulations and policies that they're forced to abide by to make sure it's a little bit more fair. And why would they do that? Because we're part of this country. We have money. We can control where we spend our money. We have a vote. We can control when we give our vote. And so instead of appealing to their hearts, we appeal to their rationale, their ability to negotiate. Hey, you want our vote? You want us to be citizens of this country? You want our dollar? Then we require X, Y, and Z. So a realistic solution to white supremacy or the privilege is to first identify the privilege. And in this book, she did a very, very good job of doing that. Once we find the different areas of privilege that we think are unfair and eventually need to change, from there, we need to have smart politicians, economists, and sociologists to construct policies we can implement in law that will make sure that these things are implemented a little bit more fairly to create parity in society. So really, overall, I think it's very important for white people to read this book if they at least want to understand how black people think and why we complain about the things we complain about. That's the true value of this book. I don't think it's fair to expect the average everyday white person to run around seeing themselves as privileged. Nor do I think it's fair for them to stop acting in their self-interest just because they have an advantage. And I don't think it's fair or realistic or even smart for a black person to run around with this ideology and even expect white people to do this. It's almost childish. But I do think that as a society, because we all are agreeing to live together, do have a responsibility to look at these things and at some point implement policies, procedures, and regulations to basically bring these things back into parity. Otherwise, we cannot continue to participate in this system. And that's really what it comes down to. So I hope this overall lecture about this book, Me and White Supremacy, was interesting. I think that if you're interested in the book, you should definitely read it. It's a good read if you want to know how white supremacy is actually acted out in society on a daily basis and how white people are kind of analogous in this process. But where this book falls short, in my personal opinion, is that it doesn't offer a realistic solution. Its solution is essentially white people be more self-aware and empathetic to black people's plight. And that's not really what human beings do when they're getting ahead. We need real policies in place to force these things to happen, to bring parity in society for black people. Anyways, thank you for your time. This has been the Invisible Hand Podcast. I'm out.
The future of legal betting is finally here. Place a bet using Bitcoin right over the phone. Unlike traditional gambling sites, every bet you make with us is guaranteed a 50% probability of winning. All of our bets are one-on-one against a real person and never the house. We offer some of the most unique bets in the industry. Bets like, will LeBron James win his 5th NBA title? Will Joe Biden be elected for a second term? Will Tesla be worth $1 trillion by the end of 2022? You can bet on if it'll rain tomorrow. You can literally bet on any future event. Text the phrase I bet to the number in the description and I'll reply back with all of our available bets. Again, text the phrase I bet to the number in the description and I'll reply back with all of our available bets today.